When you look at a poster, you might think, do I find this interesting and do I get the message? Creating visual interest and clarity of communication are two main goals of composition. For certain types of graphic design disciplines, like information design, think of things like a poster illustrating how to do the Heimlich maneuver, or maybe a map of a building you're in. Clarity is essential, and maybe that's enough. But for other disciplines of design with greater promotional intent, like mobile advertisement or maybe book covers, catching people's attention is very critical. Someone has to be attracted long enough by the design's form to take the time to interpret the message. Something that's formulaic might be clear, but it could be boring, and so nobody's going to bother to look at it or spend a lot of time with it. Sometimes viewers will spend more time trying to make sense of a message if the form of the graphic design solution is interesting to them. To create interesting and comprehensible solutions, you need to develop keen compositional skills. Composition is the form, the whole spatial property and structure resulting from the visualization and arrangement of graphic elements, both type and images, in relation to each other and to the format, created with the intention to visually communicate, to be compelling, and to be expressive. Composing is about how all of the parts of your design work together, the visual organization of type and images in a graphic spatial arrangement. Defining boundaries starts with margins, the blank space to the left, right, top, or bottom edge of any printed or digital page. Basically, margins function as frames around images and typographic content, concurrently defining active or live areas of the page or screen real estate, as well as its boundaries. Considerations for determining the margins include how the margins can best present the content, white space in the form of margins increasing readability, control the proportions of the margins to produce harmony, balance, and stability, consider function and aesthetics of symmetrical versus asymmetrical margins. Almost all formats, which is the actual thing you're creating, like a book or a billboard or a business card or a brochure, across media being whether it's for print or whether it's for a computer screen or a movie screen or to be seen on a smartphone, they're rectangular. Screen media are all rectangular, but they have different aspect ratios, which is the height to width ratio. The concepts I'm going to present next apply to all media. Vertical and horizontal elements and movements parallel the edges of a rectangular or square format. In a static composition, vertical and horizontal movements are emphasized. In active compositions, diagonal or curved movements, directions that contradict or are in counterpoint to the edges of the format, are emphasized. Generally, compositions with dominating parallel movements are deemed to be placid. Compositions with counterpointing movements are more active or tense. You can manipulate vertical and horizontal lines or movements to generate an active composition. If the shape of a single surface format is extended in one direction, for example, an extended landscape-shaped rectangle for something like a billboard, parallel movements, in that case horizontal, will take on more force than those that are in a more conventional rectangular format, like a standard newspaper or tablet. All visual elements must respond to the edges of the page. They don't necessarily need to touch them. A format's boundaries fully participate in the compositional structure. They're not merely the end of the graphic space. Remember balance? This is why it's important. You envision an imaginary vertical line going down the center of a page. As you position your graphic elements, analyze how each is interacting with that midline. Do graphic elements cross the midline? Do they approach the midline? How do the graphic elements interrelate in the central space of the composition? Look at how these elements in this symmetrical design are interacting with the midline. The terms closed and open refer to the way the graphic elements of a composition relate to the edges of the format. Basically, if the internal elements' directions and orientations echo the format's edges to a great extent, and the viewer's focus is kept tightly within the format, that composition is considered closed. If the major directions and orientations within the composition oppose the edges, so they're on a diagonal, or they direct our eye past the boundaries of the format, then that composition is considered open. Here we go again with symmetrical versus asymmetrical. Whether in print or on screen, each static single format has a vertical axis. Imagine a line down the center of the format. The equal distribution of visual weight on either side of that vertical axis is the key to establishing balance. In a symmetrical composition, like you did for your placemats, corresponding forms are arranged on either side of the vertical axis. In general, balance achieved through symmetry yields stable and often static as opposed to active results. This is not a qualitative critique of symmetry, but a consideration for how to use this compositional approach. Some people hold the idea that viewers respond with less interest to symmetrical compositions than to the variations inherent in an asymmetrical composition. There are too many variables in any compositional arrangement to hold such a generalized opinion about the potential for visual interest and expressive communication. Visual results always depend on the specific composition. There are many uninteresting asymmetrical compositions and very interesting symmetrical compositions. In an asymmetrical composition, arranging a balanced composition does not rely on symmetry. Forms are arranged to counterbalance each other without mirrored opposite visual weight and positioning. To achieve a balanced asymmetrical composition, you consider the position and visual weight, the size, the texture, the color, the value of each graphic element in relation to the others and to the format. Asymmetry is not a formulaic approach to a composition. Asymmetry often is more active due to its inherent variations, but does not necessarily have more impact than symmetry. In asymmetrical compositions, where complementary graphic elements are positioned in counterpoint, visual weight deliberations are strategic, not formulaic. To understand balancing a composition through counterpoint, think of every visual weight you position in a composition requiring a contrasting counterbalancing force, strategically placed in the composition. In music, the most rudimentary way to think of counterpoint is note against note. In design, counterpoint is the use of contrast, or the interplay of graphic elements in a work simultaneously providing unity and variation. In any balanced composition, if you move one graphic element, you will need to consider the balance of the entire composition. A plane is a flat surface, and the picture plane is the blank flat surface plane of a print or digital single static page. When you set out to compose on a two-dimensional surface like the screen or a piece of paper, you start with the picture plane. As soon as you make a mark, draw a line, place a letter form, or any other graphic element on that surface, that mark interacts with the picture plane and the parameter of the format. The marks you make in the composition you create can maintain the flat picture plane, or it can create the illusion of spatial depth. The illusion of spatial depth means the appearance of three-dimensional space, where some things appear closer to the viewer and some things appear further away, just as in actual space. The illusion of spatial depth can be shallow or deep, recessive or projected. One diagonal line can evoke the illusion of depth. It is possible to create such impressive illusions that the viewer at first sight doubts whether the thing depicted is real or a representation. This effect is called trompe l'oeil. The use of shadows and overlapping shapes can create effects, fooling the viewer into thinking the elements are actually adhered to the surface rather than an illusion, which appeals to our tactile sense. In this image, an irregular or Baroque pictorial space, which is referring to Flemish Baroque painting, diagonal elements and planes move in front of as well as behind the picture plane, creating the illusion of depth and action, suggesting an aggressive spatial property. In pictorial space, the picture plane can be manipulated into the illusion of spatial planes. There are three main planes with many others in between. The foreground, which is the part of a composition that appears nearest the viewer, the middle ground, which is an intermediate position between the foreground and the background, and the background, the part of the composition that appears in the distance or behind the most important parts. To create the illusion of three-dimensional space, graphic elements positioned in the foreground are bigger, rendered in greater detail. They are brighter. They have more contrast than those in the middle ground and the background. This conventional Western pictorial illusion of space on a two-dimensional surface imitates the way we perceive forms in the real world. Forms appear to become smaller and grayer as they move away from us and recede into the distance. If you draw a tilted plane on a surface, you create the illusion of three-dimensional space. The viewer understands the longer side of the plane to be closer in space and perceives the plane as receding. You could suggest a floor plane in a room space with a tilted plane. Perspective is based on the idea that diagonals moving toward a point on the horizon, called the vanishing point, will imitate the recessions of space into the distance and create the illusion of spatial depth. Perspective is a schematic way of translating three-dimensional space onto a two-dimensional surface. Italian Renaissance artist, architect, and engineer Filippo Brunelleschi, who had reproduced a three-dimensional object in two dimensions, is credited with inventing perspective. Once learning formal mathematical perspective, most designers create the illusion of spatial depth with less formal methods by eyeballing what they see or imagine rather than using formal perspective drawing methods. When an opaque flat plane or form is placed in front of another, the overlap creates the illusion of spatial depth. Successive overlaps create the illusion of a recessive space, which can be manipulated to appear shallow or deep. When you position one form or shape in front of another, that overlap suggests that one form is closer to the viewer than another. If the form in the background is smaller than the form in the foreground, the illusion is heightened. We understand smaller size elements to be further away from us in pictorial space. If the elements in the background are grayer or lighter in value, then the illusion is heightened as well. Overlapping can function to display a familial relationship among related information or visuals. They denote associations. Overlapping can aid emphasis, utilized with such structures as nest structures and stair structures. Overlapping can also be used to create fractured space, as in the Cubist style of fine art, where multiple viewpoints are seen simultaneously. By overlapping parts of an image simultaneously or in a sequence, the illusion of space is created by layering. Layers can be opaque or transparent, aligned or purposely misaligned. Typographic layers, layers of information on maps or layers of data on charts, layers of images in motion graphics, subtitles on films. Layers can imitate actual textures found in environments. Layering can convey movement, thought, or the passage of time. Using transparency, making graphic elements transparent and layering them or positioning a graphic element over or under another or between similar elements can create the illusion of ambiguous spatial relationships, which tend to appear as shallow space. In motion-based media, transparency is utilized to create transitions. Volume on a two-dimensional surface can be defined as the illusion of a form with mass or weight, a shape with a back as well as a front. A curving line can suggest volume.